In the middle of a raging blizzard, rescuers spotted a single-chain dog, frozen and barely alive. They thought they were saving a dog from the snow. But when they broke the chain around his neck, they uncovered a secret so chilling it left everyone speechless, and exposed a mystery that had been buried in ice for over a decade. Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, swallowing everything in white. No one was supposed to be out here. The nearest neighbor lived nearly a mile away, and most of the houses had been empty for years. But chained to a rough wooden post near the sagging porch was a dog, thin as a shadow, his fur crusted with ice. His body trembled as he tried to curl tighter against the cold. Each time he lifted his head, the chain clanked, pulling taut against the iron collar locked around his neck. Snow clung to his lashes, and he closed his eyes, too tired to keep searching the darkness for help. In the distance, a few porch lights flickered as the last families hurried indoors, unaware of the life just beyond their reach. The dog let out a low, broken whine that was swallowed instantly by the wind. He didn't know if anyone would come. All he knew was that the snow was rising, and he was running out of strength. Hours later, when the blizzard had swallowed almost everything in sight, a single porch light remained on in a small house down the road. Inside, a woman stood at her window, clutching a steaming mug between her hands. She was used to winter storms, but something out there didn't feel right. She squinted into the swirling snow, trying to make sense of a dark shape slumped near the old farmhouse fence. At first, she thought it was debris blown in by the wind, but then the shape shifted, lifting its head before sagging again. Her heart lurched into her throat. Setting the mug aside, she grabbed her phone and punched in the number for animal control. Her voice shook as she spoke. "Please, you have to send someone. There's a dog out there. He's chained up in the storm. I don't know how long he's been there." The dispatcher on the other end tried to reassure her, but she could hear the urgency in their tone. Roads were nearly impassable, and it could take hours to reach the property. She hung up and pressed her hand to the cold glass, watching the distant figure. "Hold on," she whispered to the dog she'd never met. "Just hold on a little longer." By the time the animal control truck crunched onto the frozen road, darkness had swallowed the fields. The headlights swept over walls of snow piled high against the fences. Two rescuers climbed out, bracing against the wind that clawed at their coats. "There!" one shouted, pointing to the silhouette by the porch. The dog hadn't moved. For a moment, fear twisted in both their stomachs. What if they were too late? They trudged forward, each step sinking to their shins. When they finally reached him, the dog lifted his head just enough to look at them, his eyes clouded with exhaustion. Frost clung to his whiskers, and his breathing came in ragged, shallow pulls. "Oh, you poor thing," the woman whispered, her gloved hand reaching for his collar. She tried to slip it off, but the iron padlock was rusted shut. With a glance at her partner, she pulled a pair of bolt cutters from her pack. As the metal snapped, the dog flinched, then sagged against her legs. She wrapped him in a heavy blanket, feeling how frail he was beneath the fur. "Hang on, buddy," her partner murmured, lifting the bundled dog into his arms. "You're safe now. We've got you." The shelter was quiet when they arrived, the storm still raging outside. As soon as the rescuers carried the dog through the doors, the staff rushed forward with towels and heated blankets. He didn't even lift his head when they set him gently on the exam table. A veterinarian in a blue smock began to work, her touch firm but kind, as she examined the matted fur and ice-caked paws. She paused when she reached the thick iron collar. "This is ancient," she murmured, "like something you'd see in old farmyards." She turned the lock to the light and sucked in a breath. Just beneath the rust, faint letters had been etched into the metal, 3 initials and a date, almost worn away by time. "Do you see this?" she whispered to one of the rescuers. He nodded slowly, his brow furrowing. The initials matched a name they both recognized, someone who'd vanished years before without a trace. The date was even older, from a time before anyone living nearby could remember. For a moment, no one spoke. The dog lifted his head, meeting the vet's eyes with a quiet, haunted look. It was clear he hadn't just been forgotten. He was part of a story no one had dared to finish. The shelter director made the call before dawn. By the time the sun began to rise over the snow-choked roads, a police cruiser pulled up in front of the building. 2 detectives stepped inside, their boots leaving wet prints on the tile floor. The veterinarian led them to the recovery room, where the dog lay wrapped in blankets. He stirred when they approached, lifting his tired eyes to watch them. One detective knelt to read the initials etched into the padlock again, lips moving silently as he pieced together what they meant. "That's the property where he was found," he murmured. "It belonged to Margaret Albright. She disappeared 15 years ago." The other detective looked at the dog and exhaled, a cloud of breath in the cold room. "You think he was hers?" "Maybe," the first replied. "Or maybe he belonged to whoever made her disappear." Outside the glass, shelter staff and volunteers gathered, whispering. News spread fast. By noon, a local reporter was calling the shelter for comment. Inside, the detectives exchanged a grim look. What had begun as a simple rescue was quickly turning into a cold case coming back to life. And the only witness left was a dog who had waited in the snow for someone to listen. By evening, the story had spread beyond the county lines. News vans idled outside the shelter, their antennas rising like skeletal trees against the gray sky. Reporters spoke in urgent tones about the dog chained in a snowstorm, and the old mystery he had carried with him. Inside, the mood was hushed, but electric. Donations poured in from people who had seen his picture online. A local bakery dropped off warm food for the staff, while a hardware store offered to repair the broken fencing at the abandoned property. Volunteers arrived one after another, some carrying soft toys, others simply wanting to stand near the recovery kennel and whisper kind words. The dog, whom the vet had named Chance, watched it all with wary eyes. He still flinched if someone moved too quickly. But when the little girl of one volunteer knelt to hold out a stuffed bear, Chance slowly stretched his nose forward. For the first time, his tail moved, just a small, tentative wag, but it was enough to make the girl's eyes fill with tears. "He's going to be okay," her mother whispered, hugging her close. And for the first time since the storm, it almost felt true. The next week blurred into a steady stream of interviews, phone calls, and evidence logs. Detectives pieced together old records, tracing the deed of the abandoned property and the name etched into the rusted lock. The trail led them back to Margaret Albright's last known address, and to a relative who had inherited the land but vanished shortly afterward. Neighbors were interviewed, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Others confessed they had always wondered why no one ever claimed the property or the animals rumored to be left behind. As Chance healed, he seemed to understand that something important was happening. Each morning, he lifted his head to watch the detectives through the glass partition, his gaze steady, as if he could still remember more than anyone realized. When the final report was filed, it painted a grim picture. Margaret had likely disappeared under suspicious circumstances, and the dog had been chained there ever since, surviving on snowmelt and scraps from passing wildlife. The detective closed the folder with a sigh. "He waited all these years," he murmured. "He never left." And as Chance rested his head on his paws, there was a quiet, solemn pride in the way he finally let his eyes drift shut. When the case finally closed, the shelter staff gathered around Chance's kennel to share the news. The detective who had followed every lead came to say goodbye, crouching to rest a hand against the thick fur that had once been matted with ice. "You did more than anyone could," he whispered. "You held on." A week later, a quiet family arrived just after sunrise. The woman had read every article about Chance and called the shelter the moment the adoption was cleared. She knelt by the kennel door, her eyes warm and steady. "Hi, sweetheart," she murmured. "If you'll trust me, I'd like to take you home." Chance lifted his head and studied her face. In that long, searching look, something shifted, something that had waited years to break free. He stood slowly, every movement deliberate, and pressed his nose to her palm. The ride to his new home was silent but peaceful. As they pulled into the driveway, the woman opened the back door, and Chance stepped out onto the snow-dusted grass. Inside, a fire glowed in the hearth. He lay down beside it and let out a long, contented sigh. At last, the waiting was over, and he was finally home.